It's all about World Day Against Child Labor. The theme for this year, social justice for all and child labor. Now that front in Ghana, we have a lot to talk about because we're not faring our best, you should say. But joining us for that conversation, we have Kwame Mensah. He is the ILO country representative, the International Labour Organization country representative. He joins the conversation. We also have in the studio James Kofi Annan, President, Challenging Heights. Let me say a very good morning to you, sir, Mr. Annan.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining the conversation, and thanks for what you're doing, especially in this light. Mr. Mensah, can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you very much. Good morning. I am not the country representative of ILO. I'm only one of the many national program coordinators. Thank you.
Okay, so one of the national coordinators, you said? Mr. Mensah, did you just say one of the national program coordinators? I just want to confirm. All right, so we'll work on his connection and get back to him, but at least I heard something like national program coordinator, one of them. But let me come to you, Mr. Annan, in the studio. When you look at the state of child labor, child protection, so to speak, on that front in Ghana, what picture comes to mind?
Well, I think we have a long way to go. I think as a nation, we have not fared well. In terms of both how we have approached the fight and our own structure in fighting against child labor. And I say this with a number of reasons. So we have the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Protection, and then the child labor situation is being fought by the Child Labor Unit, which is under the Ministry of Employment and Labor Relations. Now we know that all welfare issues concerning children, issues concerning gender, vulnerability are all supposed to be handled by the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Protection. So if you have placed the Child Labor Unit under the Ministry of Employment and Labor Relations, then obviously you're going to have a disconnection and there's not going to be a coordination in the approach towards fighting against child labor. If you have, let's say, 1,000 Ghana cedis to spend, you have to split it between these ministries, and it will not be efficient. So that is one of the reasons why we have not fared so well. But also more importantly is that we have not invested so much in the fight against child labor. We enacted the Children's Act in 1998. The Children's Act spells out what child labor is and who is supposed to work at what point. It is not acceptable in any shape or form that a child below the age of 18 will engage in hazardous work. Hazardous work includes fishing, mining, and forced prostitution. So these are all things that have been defined already. And in Ghana, we have the hazardous work framework that defines what a child can do and what a child cannot do. Now, if you don't invest well, and when I say investment, I mean funding for the state institutions such as the Child Labor Unit, the Children's Department, the Department of Social Welfare, etc., they are not going to be able to do their work. I mean, just imagine a ministry's department that in a whole year is giving less than 200,000 to fight against a situation where it's endemic. In Ghana, we are talking about 21% of children's population between the ages of 5 and 17 all being in child labor.
I mean, I've heard of similar situations with social welfare, for example. The pittance they get versus working across the country. So I understand exactly what you mean. But what does that really mean in terms of, I mean, these deficiencies in terms of logistics, in terms of funding? How do they impact the work?
Well, it means that we are losing the battle. You know, I know that globally, because of the COVID pandemic, the battle was already lost. But I think we could have done better.
The battle was already lost?
Lost, yes. So globally, about a decade ago, we used to have 245 million children in child labor, according to the ILO. Now, by 2016, the figure had reduced from 245 million to 151 million children in child labor. Unfortunately, as at now, we have reversed the trend to 160 million children being in child labor. So almost about 9 million children have been added to the stock of children who are in child labor.
Wow.
So that impacts a lot, everywhere. I mean, these figures are coming from different countries. But in Ghana, we were doing much better at a point.
At which point?
I remember when the human trafficking law was passed in 2005. Mm-hmm. I mean, ILO played a lot of role, and that's why I'm happy that Kwame was going to join us on this conversation. ILO played a lot of role when they introduced the program on the elimination of child labor. And the Ministry of Employment and Labor Relations also tackled the issue in cocoa sector by even passing and establishing child labor monitoring systems. That was a very good thing to do. But now, nearly everything is stagnant. And so we are unable to progress at the same rate as we're progressing in the early 2000s to the late 2000s. So that's why we are retrogressing rather rapidly. Of course, we know that in the face of the COVID pandemic, when children were not in school, they were in homes and schools were closed, it presented a lot more vulnerabilities, and that's why I'm seeing a lot of increase in the numbers. Just imagine along the Lake Volta, we did a report last year that stated that 60% of all children living there were found in child labor. So that is the kind of situation that we are dealing with. Nationally, I have said that we are 21% children who are in child labor between the ages of 5 and 17. But
that is a fifth, 1/5 of the child population.
Exactly. But the figure is more even staggering other places in this country. In the northern Ghana, we have 33% of all children.
I was even about to reference that. Yes. About 33%.
33% of all children in the northern region who are in child labor. In fact, in Upper West region, we have 44% of all children between ages of 5 and 17 who are in child labor. And the shocking thing is that when it goes to the farming areas, the cocoa growing areas, the agricultural areas in general, we have 79% of all children between the ages of 5 and 17 who are in child labor.
Very worrying dynamics. Let me bring in Mr. Mensah of the ILO, one of the national program coordinators. And looking at the figures, I mean, if you'd recall, there was a time, sometime this year, if I'm not mistaken, where Al Jazeera came out with a report from one of our farming communities. And it suggested that, the child labor situation was rife over there. From where you sit, what are the real dynamics of child labor in Ghana? Have we made any progress, or are we retrogressing?
My brother, I hope you can hear me clearer.
I can hear you now. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. The work against child labor is progressing, and I thank Kofi for the explanations he has given and other more things to say. Ghana has ratified the key ILO conventions regarding child labor. So in that context, the country is on the right path. Convention 138 on minimum age for employment, and then Convention 182 on the worst forms of child labor. Ghana has a constitution that in Article 28 reflects the need that every child who is in work that is not helpful to his education, health and development should be protected. There's a very comprehensive Children's Act that is also being revised at the moment. So in terms of the legal framework, there are gaps here and there, but generally, Ghana is not doing badly. In terms of appreciating the concept...
When you say Ghana is not doing badly, I always like specifics. if we're not doing badly, how well are we faring? Mr. Annan in the studio was saying that, especially on the back of some of the policies that we've brought to bear, acts, laws, and all of that, from the early 2000s, we had made some inroads all the way till the end of the early 2000s. So let's say from 2010 thereabouts, the situation has not exactly been what we would want. If you look at the figures he just mentioned, some 33% in the northern region, specifically, about 44%, was it in the upper east or upper west region. When you come down south, it is prevalent. In fact, along the Volta Lake, over 60% of the children are engaged in some form of child labor. So how well, then, are we faring?
All right, so I placed that thing in the legal context. So in terms of legal framework, there is a good framework to deal with child labor, and it's important to start from there. In terms of the actual policies and their implementation, one of the key ways to judge, and that is what the indicator for the SDG target 8.7 is clear, numbers of children, proportions of children that are in child labor, and you hit it right there with Kofi. So there are significant numbers of children who must be removed. Indeed, if there's even just one child who is in worst form of child labor, he or she must be out. In terms of policies, I mean, I'm not speaking for the country. From the ILO perspective, one of the things we recommend is the design and implementation of national plans of action. And so we have provided a lot of technical support for this to be done. And I am aware that today they are going to launch the next national plan of action. The issue about coordination that Kofi talked about at the beginning is critical. So all agencies must be on board. And let's be very clear on this. Child labor is first a labor issue, okay? It's a labor issue. There are many other issues that affect children: child nutrition, child education, child malnutrition, child health, and all that. When it comes to child labor, it's important to keep the focus on labor issues, because 15 to 17-year-olds who are children, because they are below 18 years, can be employed in work. The work must just not be hazardous, and they must be given their labor rights. So that category of children should be given the protection and the employment that they need. And if this is dealt with, a chunk of child labor would have been dealt with. So having the labor ministry house the child labor unit is not a bad idea, but one agency cannot do it all. So there must be coordination. So there's a national steering committee, as far as I know, that deals with child labor issues. It has brought on board the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Protection, the Ghana Police Agency, and even at the district assembly, they try to set up programs to bring in everybody. So the coordination bit is also growing. So it must be very clear that the infrastructure, both in terms of institutional framework and legal framework, is not that bad. But agroniform, so how is this affecting the numbers of children? I think that the emphasis now should be going on prevention, because as you remove and more are entering, you will not see any difference. And when the ILO held the last global conference in Durban, we clearly communicated in the action plan that prevention is better than cure. So we encourage that policies should focus on preventive measures. 3 of them: education, social protection, okay, and now social justice, as we talk about the World Day Against Child Labor this year. So the support that we are giving is to give direction in this manner, and we think that it's important to build on it block after block. The role of civil society groups is very much appreciated and is important. Everywhere in the world, the ILO experience has shown that civil society organizations cannot be left behind, and there must be transparency and accountability everywhere, including that space. But the ILO strategy is to work with social partners. So you would know that to make sure that there's proper organization for children to be removed out of child labor and kept in school, and then emphasis on education. So we know groups like the General Agricultural Workers Union, we know groups like the Ghana Mine Workers Union, the National Union for Seamen, Ports and Allied Work. All these groups are working towards sealing the issue of children getting into child labor. So prevention is critical. The learning outcomes are also critical, because you would know that we are getting to a situation where we have second generation child laborers. That is to say, for example, a 15-year-old boy who would be in child labor may have grow and become maybe 17-year-old and have a child with a lady, and then the child is 5 years old. He is 17. The mother of the girl is 16, and then this child who is 5, maybe in a certain situations. You get what I mean? So we have to make sure that jobs are also provided for legally employable children, 15 to 17, and even for adults. Social protection must be given to adults because poverty is still an underlying situation of child labor. So if families have good jobs, they are trained to manage their income, and it's not just livelihood empowerment, but economic empowerment, so that they move up from the survival level to economic viability, so that if in the cocoa season they get money, they have understanding in economics and bookkeeping, and they are able to reinvest in other areas, so that when the lean season comes, they'll have enough money to hire, for example, adult labor to weed their cocoa farm instead of using their children and other people.
Let me come back into the studio, Mr. Anand. So there's also the other dimension of this. Yes, there are those in that small window who can still be employed, though they qualify as children because they are under 18, the 15 to 17-year group that has been spoken about, Mr. Mensah was just talking about. But when it comes to, it always gets me upset, the street urchins, the child beggars on the streets. What is your take on that situation? We do know that a number of them may not be Ghanaian, but a number of them also are Ghanaian. What's your take on that?
Well, Kwame is a very experienced person when it comes to this space, so I respect some of the things that he has mentioned. I think there are a lot of debatable comments that's made. If we had the time, we'll go into some of them. But we have the Azedos child labor framework that defines what a child can do and what a child cannot do. And I'm making reference to what the question you just asked. There are certain words, whether you are 15, 16, 17, you cannot do. You shouldn't go there. That includes street begging. That includes fishing, mining, forced prostitution. These are not employable items for us to, they are not negotiable at all. So whether the person is poor or not poor, that window is closed to that person. Therefore, once you and I all see these children on the street begging, we must immediately have to act. When you have ratified laws, and we thank the government for ratifying those kind of conventions, that themselves do not remove the children from the streets. Ratification without action. Without action. And you rightly said, right here from Kokomemre to the street when you're getting to other Paloma areas, you see them. These are foreigners that can easily be taken and be rehabilitated and be supported. Are we waiting to ratify laws before we do that? No. Yes, prevention is good, but prevention, taking the children off the street themselves, is part of prevention. Are we not hearing a lot of stories of how vehicles have knocked down children on the street? So if we remove them before that happened, that would have prevented the thing from happening. But let me go into some specifics. I sometimes become a bit
since
emotional.
we do not have that much time,
yes,
I would ask you to be a bit brief with it so that we can wrap in the next point. But you go ahead.
You see, I become a bit emotional when it comes to some of these things because myself, when I was a child, I endured it.
You endured what specifically?
Child labor.
Child labor, right.
From age 6 to age 13.
That must have been traumatizing.
Very traumatizing. So I feel how these children feel. We have a 13-year-old girl who has a 1-year-old son.
13?
Yes, 13.
She has a 1-year-old son.
1-year-old baby out of this situation. A number of these children who are just sent to Lake Volta, girls especially, a girl of 10, 11 years, sent there to serve as a sex material for other boys to be motivated to work more for a fisherman. And you think that that is a window for that child to gain employment? No. So you see how I become emotional.
So in other words, what you just mentioned, that is sex slavery.
Sex slavery.
So this girl is brought in as some sort of, pardon my language, incentive for boys to go and work. The harder they work.
Exactly.
Wow.
You don't have to make any excuse for that language. That is what it is. And so when we are talking about these issues, and I remember some of the things that I had to go through and the things that other children are going through now, I'm not talking law. The framework is good. And Ghana has very good framework. The Children's Act itself would have been enough. The human trafficking law would have been enough. We have national plan of actions upon national plan of actions every 3 years. They are enough. The conventions being ratified, enough. But we need action. At least government should invest minimum 10 million Ghana cedis to its own agencies that are providing the work to end child labor.
Okay.
Child labor unit, human trafficking secretariat, anti-human trafficking unit of Ghana Police Service, DOFSU, they must be resourced to address the issue. If that is done, you will see that we don't need more laws.
At least 10 million needed. And that story about the young girl, 13 years with a child of 1 year already, I mean, that is just crazy. And this whole bit about incentivizing with sex and sex slavery. Yeah.
So how old was he when he got pregnant?
12.
No.
You're talking
less
about...
than 12. Because
so the
13 with 1 year old, it means he gave birth at the age of 12. So he got pregnant at the age of 11.
Anyway. Mr. Mensah, you have the final bite. In some 30 seconds, what's your final take as we wrap this conversation?
I totally agree with the point that Kofi makes. I think that it's important for us to focus on the children who are in worst forms of child labor and other forms of child labor. When I talk about 15 to 17-year-olds who are legally employable, of course, I wasn't referring to children doing hazardous work. The point I was making is that when we create employment for young people, the prevention measures become stronger, and then we don't enter into a second generation of child labor. The numbers we have in Ghana are huge, and they are huge in other places as well. So pragmatic efforts must be put in place. Transparency, accountability, and consistency. The child labor monitoring system must be effective. Business, private sector should come into the space, and we should focus on the child, not necessarily on the sector, because children move from sector to sector. And when there's equality, when there's social justice, we can fight against child labor sustainably. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James Kofi Annan, joining me in the studio. He is President Challenging Heights.
Yes.
Is there something, I see you to be itching to say something?
Yeah, I'm happy with what the last comment Kwame made about businesses. I think that businesses have acted as though the issue is not their issue, and I think that is quite irresponsible. All businesses must join in the fight against child labor because they are culpable. They are promoters, they are linked, and in their supply chains, there are issues of child labor and child trafficking. We must act. We must act.
James Kofi Annan is President Challenging Heights. We also had Kwame Mensah, who is one of the national programs coordinators for the International Labour Organization in Ghana. And that's how we mark World Day Against Child Labor 2023. The theme is social justice for all, end child labor. And all of us are involved. We are playing our part as a media entity.